Now back to Brian Bushlach's Business Briefing on FM News 101.
And welcome back as we open up our conversation with David Porter, who is a partner and shareholder at Geffen, one of the top accounting firms in town. And we met a couple of weeks back, Dave, and we talked forensic accounting. And I want to really, first of all, define what that means for our business owner listeners.
Well, thank you, Brian. For this purpose, forensic accounting is really occupational fraud, so that unfortunate situation where an employee may have taken some trust that was placed with him or her and took advantage of it. So it's employee theft.
Okay, so our audience is hopefully unfamiliar with that. That hasn't happened to them yet. But for the folks out there who it has, this can sneak up on people, can't it?
Well, that's right. And really what we'd like to do today is help your listeners avoid that situation and create an awareness where they won't become a victim of occupational fraud.
Okay, you've got some pretty incredible stories that we'll share in our next segment. First, though, let's talk about the cost of occupational fraud. This can really be damaging, can't it?
Well, it really can, and some of the statistics that we'll cite in this discussion come from an Association of Certified Fraud Examiners organization, and they've put together a study. It's a global study, and we'll really focus on the costs as they relate to U.S. corporations and really try to focus on smaller employers that might be more relevant to your listening audience. But the cost on average is about $140,000.
Man, that is incredible.
It is. It's a staggering number.
So this must take place in most cases then over a number of years.
It does. It on average takes place over a couple of years, and it's a little bit here and a little bit there, and it adds up. And some of the frauds, about 20% of the frauds, exceed $1 million. So that $140,000 is just an average.
Now, I know it depends on the business and the situation, and we'll talk more about that, as I mentioned, in about 15 minutes. But how do employees pull this off? I mean, you would think that in the days we live in here with the technology and, the oversight, that it would be very difficult to do this these days.
You would think so, and that's a good question as far as the technology that's involved. But surprisingly, a lot of these schemes are very simple in their approach, and they're just followed consistently, and they're right under the owners' noses. And while the owners are busy building their businesses and creating jobs and watching the bottom line, they have placed trust in an employee that becomes misplaced.
It's sad, but it does happen. Now, how do they find out typically? What's the trigger point?
Well, there are a lot of ways that companies find out that they've been defrauded. And the worst way is when you get a call from the police saying, we've discovered a fraud that's taking place in your business, because that means it's probably going to be a really large loss. And it's going to be something that's hard to recover from. But most frauds, quite interestingly, are discovered through an anonymous tip, through a hotline frequently. That's the most frequent way that you discover something going on in your business.
And what's the source of that tip? What's going on?
Usually it's a coworker, but it could be another employee within the business or a customer or a vendor.
Maybe a disgruntled spouse.
Could be a disgruntled spouse. Very good point.
Very interesting. So you say the police notify you, so it comes through a tip line or perhaps through other criminal activity maybe?
Yes, it can. And when we get into the subject of collusion, it's a very complicated scenario, but most of these frauds are perpetrated by a single employee, and those tips usually come in anonymously from a coworker. Sometimes they're set up through formal hotlines, and there are a number of services available out throughout the country for companies to utilize, including some based right here in Portland, or it could simply be a note that's passed to the boss.
Dave Porter is a shareholder at Geffen, one of the top accounting firms here in town. We'll pass along his contact information in just a little bit, but you talked about the perpetrators, and I want to kind of go in depth on this a little bit because it might surprise our business owner audience who typically is responsible for this type of crime.
Well, it is surprising. You would think that, well, let me back up a little bit. When we talk about these occupational frauds, they really come in two flavors, if you will. There are what we call asset misappropriations, and those are the most frequent type where somebody, an employee, is simply stealing an asset, and that asset is usually cash. Not maybe cash out of a cash register. It could be out of your bank account, but they're stealing an asset. The other type of fraud that you frequently see are financial statement frauds, where the financial statements are simply overstated. The books have been cooked, if you will. Those frauds are usually the ones that carry with them a much higher loss. And the ones that usually suffer a loss are not only the company, but maybe a bank that's loaned money to the company.
And it sounds to me, Dave, like in many cases, this could be Martha, the bookkeeper, who we love, and she's been with the company for 10 years, and gosh, she's a loyal employee, and she's here every morning at 7 a.m., and she'll stay late and come in on the weekends, and she's really a great employee, but she's dipping into the till.
You're absolutely right. Those are the employees who are like family to the owner. He or she's been entrusted with all of the books, the records, frequently is a check signer, has the ability to reconcile the bank account, really has all the trust that the owner places in any employee. And that trust is frequently a substitute for strong internal controls. And in this economy, it's hard to justify hiring people just to segregate responsibilities within your company. So instead of that, you place a lot of trust in one individual. And that's where, unfortunately, sometimes you're burned.
Wow. Dave Porter, Geffen Mesher joining us. I'm Brian Bushlach. This is Business Briefing on FM News 101. And what astonishes me, Dave, is the fact that we have incredibly brilliant business owners who don't catch this. Why not? What is the biggest reason they don't catch this?
They're really focused on running their businesses. They're watching that top line. They're trying to generate sales. They're caring for their employees. They're trying to keep the jobs in place. They're watching their bottom lines. All those things take a lot of work, especially in these economic times. So they're not often as aware of what's going on within their financial statements, within their accounting department, and that's where the problems start.
Okay, let's fast forward now, and let's provide solutions. Okay, we'll tell stories and follow that with more solutions in our next segment. But I want to ask you, because I know our audience is dying to know, what can they do right now if they think everything's fine, but they just maybe want to be extra sure? What can they do without maybe tipping off the staff or tipping off the employee and not upsetting anyone, just to make sure everything checks and balances?
There are a number of things that a business owner can do to protect themselves and help protect the company's assets. One of the easiest things to do is to have a duplicate copy of your bank statement sent directly from the bank to your home. Open that bank statement, take a look at it. Look at the checks that are clearing. You may get a little image, or you may simply get a check number and an amount. You'll also see what's clearing through your bank account electronically, not through a paper check, but maybe through a wire transfer or what's called an ACH. Look at those things. If you're not sure what they are, take your bank statement into the office tomorrow and ask your bookkeeper or controller, what are these transactions? Would you show me the support for them? That puts everybody on alert that you're watching what's going on.
You know, you had mentioned that one of the tricks is to open an accounts payable to a phantom account, basically ABC Engineering or whatever it may be, and that in many cases is how the fraud is perpetrated over not only months but years and years, because it looks like a vendor. So even if the business owner is reviewing the books, they see a vendor there, a payment's going out, and it's actually going out to the bookkeeper.
That's
right?
exactly right, and that's one of the more frequent ways that companies are defrauded by their employees. Or fraudulent vendors, frequently a fictitious company made up, and the checks are sent out without adequate support, and sometimes the bookkeeper is even a check signer. So again, look at those checks. If you see a vendor, you're not familiar with the name, ask for the details.
And not big numbers always either. These
usually
are
small numbers.
Small numbers.
Over and over.
Kind of like a slow drip.
It's like a slow drip.
Oh, boy. Dave Porter from Geffen Mesher joining us here on Business Briefing. He's a forensic accountant, actually launched forensic accounting at the Geffen Mesher firm. Great background. I'll tell you more about his background in our next segment. But what else can we do real quick? We'll give our listeners the rest of what they can do in our next segment. But one other thing before we hit the break here.
One other quick idea. Get personal with your payroll. Get those payroll reports from your third-party provider, or maybe your payroll is done internally. Look at those payroll reports. See if you recognize all those employee names. See if the amounts that are being paid to those employees make sense to you. See if there are any bonuses that shouldn't be in there, any commissions that shouldn't be in there, any overtime that shouldn't be in there. So get personal with your payroll.
You got to get involved. That's for sure, business owners. David Porter, Geffen Mesher joining us up against the break here at the bottom of the hour. When we come back, Dave will share some real stories that he's been involved with. We'll change the names and the companies to protect those folks. But you won't believe the fraud that goes on in businesses, not only big business, but small business. That's up next with Dave Porter from Geffen Mesher when Business Briefing continues here on FM News.